What I'm going to present today is a presentation that we've done, me and a few of my colleagues at Hebrew over the years, about some of the academic issues that relate to the Bedouin in the Negev. I think you want to take this computer though, no? Because outside of this question of some of the political sides of this coin, there's also an academic side. And some of this relates to some of the international efforts on behalf of the Bedouin or to discuss their rights. And you shouldn't underestimate this side of the coin in terms of the international legal aspects or the way in which NGOs or academics play a role in this debate, because they are able to craft, some of our knowledge in terms of what we know. And when newspapers write about the Bedouin, who do they go to? They go to professors, they talk to people, NGOs. And in Israel, this is a small country, a lot of times people wear the same hats, right? Someone's a professor at Ben-Gurion University, he's also working with this land campaign, what have you. So I'm just going to introduce some issues related to this subject. And one of them has to do with this idea of indigenousness. But before we get there, I just was asked to give kind of a preview of some of the issues dealing with the Bedouin so you can see it on paper. Now, it's in the news all the time, the Bedouin of the Negev, and usually it's a story like this. It talks about a government decision to do something, and then you hear about how the decision is somehow racist or it's going to cause some sort of problem. And many times even when these are small issues, just dealing with 6 families or something, this will make it into the international news. You'll see this in the New York Times, about Israel evicting, a few families, a few trailers somewhere. So this is an important issue. And sometimes a photo will accompany what you're seeing, and you get to see something like this, which is a few houses. It's something that looks quite impoverished. But it's important to understand that in the Negev today, there are 5 types of settlement, basically. From those of you, most of us who come from abroad, if we come from the States, we don't think about the idea that every group of people is sort of shoehorned into a different type of settlement. Well, if you're an Arab, you live in this kind of style settlement. Well, if you're a Jew, you live here, and if you're, a Mizrahi Jew, you're over there. But in Israel, a lot of times the settlements are ethnically homogenous, as many of you might know. So, for instance, we have large Jewish development towns, right, like Beersheba, where you have all sorts of people that immigrated from all over the world. Then you have the Bedouin development towns that the government set up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, of which there are around 7, a few more than that. And then you have what is called these unrecognized villages, which is what Regavim is dealing with at times in terms of this question of illegal settlement, people that have usually illegally decided to squat on state lands, or sometimes private land. And then you have also the newer phenomenon of what is called like a private Jewish farm. And you also have, of course, your smaller rural Jewish communities, like the kibbutzim or the moshavim. So it's a little bit hard to see, but when you look at some of these, what is called these unrecognized Bedouin settlements, you see a bunch of small farmsteads, small houses spread over large areas of land. And when you look at a traditional Jewish town, you see something like this. Lots of people crammed into a relatively small area. These are all taken from the same altitude, so you can see the difference. You might only have a few hundred people in this photograph living in small dwellings. And you might have 33,000 people crammed into a similar area. And then you might have, for instance, like a kibbutz or a moshav, like a shalim, with 271 people. But you can see from the background of the planning that the actual area of settlement where the people live is quite small. So this is kind of what we're dealing with in terms of the way people are living. Now, what we hear about a lot is, we hear reports about what's going on in the Negev. So for instance, there was a Physicians for Human Rights just wrote a document a few years ago which talked about how there were Bedouin residents of the Negev holding 245,000 dunams of land, constitutes about 1.3% of the Negev, and there are 75,000 people living in these unrecognized villages. And a lot of times these reports confuse different things. They confuse land holdings with land use versus land ownership. Almost these 75,000 people or so that live in these 50 unrecognized, what is called the village, but in fact it's just a long stream of little sheds and settlements and houses. There's no private ownership in these places. There's no title deeds, no physical document that says anyone owns any of it, right? At the same time, you have a lot of land that is being held in the sense that people are de facto sitting on the land, right? And in terms of land use, the actual land use might be even bigger because people are using it for pasturing animals or they're building roads there. So the actual land that is being used is quite big sometimes. So just to get an idea that sometimes in terms of the terms you see are slightly different. Now, why was there all of a sudden a campaign for indigenous rights? Why all of a sudden did people that were basically squatting illegally on land, and maybe they could say, well, we've lived here for 30 years, we have some sort of eminent domain, we have some sort of squatters' rights. Can't the government find some solution to this? The idea of crafting an indigenous discourse about the Bedouin was to say that indigenous rights transcend the normal rights we might have in terms of, well, I bought this house and now it's my house. If you're an indigenous person, like we talk about, for instance, on the first page you saw like a Native American juxtaposed with, for instance, a Bedouin on a horse. If you're indigenous, you think of what happens in Canada or some of these other places where there's a reservation system, right? Where there's some system of land set aside for a group of people, and on that land the people do kind of whatever they want, they run their own affairs. So the idea is saying, well, all these illegal Bedouin settlements, which as I said, it's only something like 70,000 people living in 50 different places, the idea of saying, well, let's draw a line around this and say it's indigenous, is an easy way to say that none of these people have to come and prove and say, yes, I bought this land, I've paid taxes on it. It's an easier way to say, okay, let's write all that off and draw a line around it and say, okay, this is now a reservation or what have you, indigenous. And the question that might be asked, of course, is, well, what if in 10 years, those people have moved off of that, where the line was drawn that was indigenous, and moved into a new area and squatted illegally there? Well, then what do? Do you just say, well, now that's indigenous to this area? Or does the government finally decide to actually evict some of the people? So just to get an idea of why the indigenous campaign appeals to some people. And you can see in many of the writings, I mean, I can send this to someone, I'm not going to read through all this, but you can see that more and more people talk about the Palestinian Bedouin. Mind you, Palestinian. Several years ago, it was just Bedouin. But now you hear about the Palestinian Bedouin of Israel and how they are the indigenous Arab inhabitants or indigenous inhabitants. We'll talk in a few minutes about what indigenous means in terms of the international legal context. But just you see how the debate is changing and how people talk about this. And another thing that's interesting that runs into this indigenous thing is when they say, well, the Bedouin are indigenous. Therefore, when we plan to build a town that we want to say, okay, we're going to build a town for Bedouin, the planning shouldn't be, for instance, how we plan for other groups. Bedouins shouldn't have to live like this, because this is how Jews live, right? That's Dimona. So when we plan, we talk about a culture of planning in terms of ethnic planning needs. And that's a new concept. The concept basically says, and you can read it here in bold, that ethnic planning needs, by contrast, are properly fulfilled when different ethnic groups receive differential treatment in similar situations on account of the fabric of their cultural social characteristics. I'll give you a second to digest that. What that means is this. This is a simple way of understanding this long, complicated sentence. You have to take the group from the top, and based on their ethnic racial features, you must decide where they belong. Right? And that's what this is saying. Each group, based on its race and its ethnicity, it fits into a certain binyan, a certain place, right? So if you're, for instance, Ethiopian, well, they have to go here. And if they're Bedouin, well, they deserve to be here. Everyone's culture supposedly dictates exactly how they have to live. Not everyone can live in an apartment complex. No, God, no, that doesn't make sense. That might work in America, of course, right? But no, not here. So when we start to talk about indigenous rights and ethnic planning paradigms, what they're basically saying is the Bedouin have illegally moved into large sections of land which they would like to retain, and we're going to decide that we're going to create a planning paradigm that will allow them to retain this. Now, I'll go into some of the academic work we did. We wanted to look at some of these questions of, how did this indigenous context, how did this discourse begin? What is an indigenous people, right? So basically, the idea of indigenous peoples gained a lot of power, a lot of recognition at the UN in 2007. But anyone who's from the States or Canada or Australia knows that you have the concepts of Aboriginals or First Nations or Inuits that go back 150, 200 years in terms of a people that were first on the land, and you have another people that displaces them, and then in the end you want to protect some of what is left of that small group that was persecuted, so you find a way to provide for in terms of their indigenous rights. And that's where the concept came from. But the concept has grown now to say, okay, there are indigenous peoples in Africa. There are indigenous peoples everywhere in the world. It's a little bit different, a little bit complicated, because in the New World, it's quite obvious that there are people that were living there in 1492, and there were a different group of people that came there afterward. Right? It's quite black and white, basically. But if you're in Africa, how do you know who's indigenous in Nigeria, where there are 80 different linguistic groups, 200 different tribes? How do you find the first one? Now, sometimes people say, okay, well, in South Africa, you have these Bushmen. Someone saw this movie, right, about the Bushmen. Say, well, that's nice, it's indigenous. Let's give them special rights because they seem to be persecuted. Well, what about Europe? Who's indigenous where? Albanians? Serbs? Estonians? How do we know? Basques? How do you pick out who deserves a special group of rights versus what is the other state that suppresses them? It's not really clear. And so when you look at the Middle East and you ask, okay, are there indigenous groups anywhere else in the Middle East? And you look at the survey literature, you look at the research, the Bedouins, or any other group, mind you, are not usually considered indigenous anywhere. There are not usually discussions of who is indigenous, like whether it's the Coptic Christians in Egypt or Assyrians or something like that. We don't hear this term much with the Middle East. We only hear it when we start to look at Bedouins of the Negev, which, as I said, is a pretty small group compared to Bedouins throughout the Middle East. It's the same tribes in many cases, right? You have the same tribe in Sinai that you do in the Negev. The fact that there's a border there today isn't something that existed before. So when we looked at the research, we found that you had a few Bedouin scholars and Israeli Jewish scholars and they began to look at other indigenous groups in the New World, and they said, well, this research paradigm could be applied here. So you can, for instance, see Professor Ismail Abu Saad here identifying himself with this Journal of Indigenous Peoples. I'm going to skip through a few of these because I think I don't know how much time we're running short. Okay. So I'll give you another few examples. You start to see the term indigenous applied by NGOs. Human Rights Watch, right? Talking about the indigenous land rights of the Negev Bedouin. No one else has land rights in this country, but they have some special right that is above everyone else's. Mind you, even above the other Arabs in Israel, who suddenly also have less rights. Now, you see also with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, you see the term Yelidim, which is the Israeli Hebrew name for indigenous. And it's interesting, you even see publications that talk about Indigenous World. Now, I like this one the best, because you can see here on the left, who was indigenous in 2005? Well, we had marsh dwellers in Iraq, okay? And the Bedouins in Israel. Well, 2010 came along and the marsh dwellers disappeared. Well, where did they go? Did the marsh dwellers all die? No. In fact, they've had a resurgence of their culture since Saddam Hussein was thrown out. So the marsh dwellers are still there, but somehow no longer indigenous. And we can see here that now the Bedouin of Israel have become the Palestinian Bedouin of Israel. And actually down here in 2012, they have Israel and Palestine. The Bedouins are indigenous to Palestine, but they're only indigenous in Area C, right? They're only indigenous in an area that relates to Israel. I'm not making this up. You have to go and read it. They're only indigenous in one little part of Palestine. They're not indigenous when they live next to Ramallah. They're not indigenous when Mahmoud Abbas tells them that they got to move off of his whatever next to his house. No. They're only indigenous where there's a settlement. And if you take away the settlement, not indigenous anymore. Okay. It's funny, but it's true. So the UN has done a special report that said the long-standing presence of the Bedouin people throughout this geographic region, including Israel, that they seem to be connected with this indigenousness. And Israel's reply is, well, we just don't accept this. Israel doesn't really, it doesn't really deal with this question much. But it leads, obviously, to this obvious conclusion is, well, what's the indigenous side and the non-indigenous side when you're going down to the Negev? I cross into the Sinai, and here you've got the same tribesman, he's standing with me, and on one side, he's indigenous, and on the other side, we cross over here, not indigenous. It doesn't make any sense. But fine, that's where the research is. And I was asked also just to give a brief mention of another side of this coin, which is you often hear that the Bedouin, where they live in the Negev, that where they're living predates the state of Israel. Well, that then plays on your emotions because you think, well, this doesn't seem fair, right? Here's a guy who's living here. He's living under the Ottomans, they come and go. The British, it comes and goes. And Israel's here now. And all of a sudden Israel's telling him, you're living there illegally. Well, that doesn't make sense. If a guy's living somewhere for 60 years, how can he be living there illegally so long? So a lot of times you hear that this place has been there for 60 or 80 years, and thus it's got this roots in the ground that it seems unfair to demolish it. As you can see, this woman standing next to her demolished house at El Araqib. But when you go to the aerial photos, and I think aerial photos don't usually lie, you can see, for instance, the British photo at the bottom. Here's 1945, January 13th or what have you. It's hard to see from there maybe, but you can see at the top is the 2007 photo. 2007 photo has a few caravans or what have you, and the photo on the bottom has nothing. Sometimes in the aerial photos, and I did a lot of surveys of these photos, you find tents. That's right, you do find tents because of course these people were nomadic. So, but when you read that the village has ancient roots, it doesn't. It doesn't predate the state. Now it could be that the people were nomadic. And then of course you say, well, what does a nomad's rights mean? Well, maybe he has rights to something. I mean, as time goes by, he in theory has rights somewhere. But the idea, the village predates the state, it's just a myth, basically. So I can run through some of these conclusions. This is basically what we've talked about. I mean, there really is virtually no evidence in terms of permanent settlement in the Negev prior to 1948. You don't have Bedouin that have title deeds to this. Now, mind you, the Ottomans opened offices to register land, and the British maintained those offices after 1857 in terms of the land law, because the Ottomans wanted to have a modern state. So people could register land. Lots of other people registered land. As any of you know, the Jewish National Fund, all these organizations that predate the state, they bought and registered land, even in the Negev. The Bedouins didn't, in many cases, because they didn't want to come forward to register the land because it meant paying taxes on it. But whatever the case may be, in almost all cases, you don't have people with real registration documents. I just want to show you one other map that I think I was asked to show so that you get an idea of how big the land claims are. Here. I think you're going to see this tomorrow, but the land claims are 800,000 dunams, up to that amount. And people will tell you, well, 800,000 dunams is only about 4 or 5% of the Negev. The Negev is so big. The Negev is more than half the land area of the state of Israel, or basically about half, depending if you're including the West Bank or not. So you're right, it's only 4% or something like that. But ask yourself then, okay, now you've got 70,000 people that would like to live on 4% of the land. But how much percent of the land do the Jews live on in the Negev? Less than 4%. So the idea that the Bedouin are 25% of the Negev, which is true, but they only have 4% of the land, the Bedouin are doing very well in terms of how much land they live on. And so if you compare them to other groups in Israel, Israeli Arabs, Jews, all the different types of Jews, you find that if you were to give them title to this small paltry sum, you will make the Bedouin the largest per capita landowners in the state of Israel. And that would be quite an irony, right? I mean, that the Bedouin would be basically the wealthiest people in Israel in terms of the ownership of land, and that the Jewish inhabitants, well, they should be stuffed into 80 square meters apartments. It doesn't really make sense, I think. So that's another side of the coin in terms of the percentage of people versus the percentage of land ownership. And I think I'll wrap it up here. I think Professor Israeli is supposed to come after me, right? So.